Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the final session of our India-Europe Policy Brief webinar series in 2025, which is jointly organized by the Council for Strategic and Defense Research and the Heinrich Böll Foundation. My name is Jochen Lückscheiter. I'm the director of the New Delhi office of HBS. Over the past months, the series has explored different facets of the EU-India partnership, from the Trade and Technology Council to the possibilities for collective action for a green transition. Each of these conversations highlighted not only areas of convergence, but also the work still required to translate a shared vision into meaningful cooperation. Today's discussion brings us to a topic that in a way sits above all the others, the future of multilateralism and the role India and Europe can play in safeguarding and reforming the rules-based international order. We, of course, meet at a time when global governance is under significant pressure. Institutions that were designed in and for a different era are struggling to respond to today's geopolitical fragmentation, technological disruption, or the climate emergency. The renewed US retreat from multilateral agreements only adds to and accelerates this uncertainty. Yet, India and the European Union continue to position themselves as advocates of cooperative, rules-based international engagement, even if their approaches, priorities, and perceptions are not always identical. The question before us is whether these two actors, with their combined diplomatic, demographic, economic, and normative weight, can move from parallel commitments to coordinated action. The policy brief being launched today explores these questions and continues the approach we have followed throughout the series, pairing one European with, in this case, two Indian authors. This model ensures that the analysis is grounded in perspectives from both sides and reflects the collaborative spirit we believe should also guide EU-India policymaking. As we conclude the series, it only feels fitting that our final discussion focuses on a multilateral reform, because if cooperation between India and Europe is to matter globally, it will probably matter the most here in this context, in shaping the norms, frameworks, and institutions that govern peace and security, trade, climate, and so forth. I would like to extend my sincere thank you to the authors of this paper, to our guest speaker and the moderator here today, and to all of you who have engaged in the series throughout the year. Thank you for joining us again, and I look forward to today's discussions and deliberations. Thank you. Over to you, Devika.
Thank you, Jochen. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Devika. I work at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, and I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of CSDR as well. A very brief introduction. CSDR is a New Delhi-based think tank, and we combine global and regional expertise to deliver tailored interventions rooted in rigorous research and experiential knowledge. And our expertise covers foreign policy, geopolitical risk, defense, etc. And we have regional expertise in the Indian subcontinent, Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar with HBS. As you can mention, this is our concluding report in our collaborative policy brief series, India-Europe Relations, Advancing Policy Alignment. So yes, we are formally launching our final report, EU-India Inevitable Partners for a Rules-Based International Order, authored by Professor C. Mohan, Dr. Tobias Scholz, and myself. Our attendees can find the report in the chat right now. We'll just drop it there for your perusal. So to kick things off, let me quickly introduce our speakers. We have Professor C. Mohan, who's a distinguished fellow at CSDR and a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. And he has previously served on India's National Security Advisory Board. Welcome, Professor Raja. We also have Dr. Tobias Scholz, who's an Asia Associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, and he focuses on India, the Indo-Pacific, and cybersecurity policy as well. Welcome, Toby.
Good morning.
We also have, as our expert panelist, Professor Amrita Narlikar, who is currently a distinguished fellow at CSDR, distinguished fellow at ORF, and an honorary fellow at the Darwin College at the University of Cambridge. She was also formerly president of the Giga Institute in Hamburg. A very warm welcome, Professor Narlikar. And finally, we have our moderator, Dr. Pratnya Vivalkar, who's a senior project manager at the Robert Bosch Academy with over a decade of expertise in international relations and strategic communications. She's also an independent expert focusing on Germany-India relations and various aspects of it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Pratnya. Some quick housekeeping notes. Request our panelists to keep their opening remarks to 5 to 7 minutes. Post the opening session and the moderated discussion, we will open the floor for questions from our attendees. Please use the Q&A box to raise your questions for the moderator's consideration. So that's all from me. I will now hand over the proceedings to you, Pratnya. Thank you so much.
So a warm welcome to everyone who is dialed into the conversation on my and our behalf. It's lovely to see all of you. Those who are in Germany, it's a cold morning. For those of you who are in different parts of India, it's a warm day. Hopefully you're having a good one. My name is Pratnya, and Devika, as just introduced, said I am an independent expert working on India-Germany relations for a while now. Thank you for having me to moderate this panel and giving me an opportunity to set the context of the conversation. And I don't think this conversation could have come at a more opportune time. I returned from Belém yesterday, from Brazil, after the COP. And I don't think there could have been a more glaring moment for me to closely observe how multilateralism kind of is coming undone at a rapid pace, also on issues where we require convergence of interests. While there is a broad consensus, barring the President of the United States, who thinks that climate change is something which we don't need to take seriously, there has been a huge divergence on how to deal with it. And in the absence of the United States, an extremely strong China that is often seen getting into huddles with its G77 partners, the shifty Europeans, strong in rhetoric, uncommitted on the delivery part of it, the Africans and the Asians fighting for climate justice as the ones who are on the forefront of facing the impacts of climate change, but also having to cater to a young aspiring population. I think the very chaotic space in itself has now become more confusing, very shrill, and a space where might trumps right, pun intended on all the words included. So this retreat from multilateral engagement, notably by the US under President Trump, but also from other actors at the table, has been setting the tone of our upcoming conversation in many ways than one. And it ranges from the termination of USAID, withdrawal from global agreements, to an increasing skepticism at an intergovernmental level around multilateral formats like the UN. When sitting in Germany, when I look back in 2022, when Chancellor Scholz gave his speech on the Zeitenwende, the inflection point in Germany's history, I think even if the speech was largely referring to where Germany found itself in, I think it also had a lot of commonalities with the EU and Europe in a broad sense. They found themselves dependent on the United States for their security, for energy on Russia largely, and for their economic well-being on China, and not to mention the internal political fissures that were rapidly being exposed. And I find myself wondering, sitting here in Europe, when I look back at India, where I come from, I'm thinking India itself finds itself at a very interesting juncture and on the different side of the spectrum. As India is now increasingly a big voice for aspirations and for concerns from the global south, ex-China, and it sees itself in this position of having to sees the responsibility for itself to go and bat for the interests of the global south. Just today, Prime Minister Modi urged his partners at the IPSA meet to push for security reforms to come together for a set of things that they could do around the climate change conversation. So basically, India sees itself as a player that is strengthening South-South alliances in many ways than one. India is also a staunch advocate and practitioner of minilateralism, or limited liability partnerships, as the word goes, and is also known to be very pragmatic about how it defines the scope and framework for cooperation with different players. So as an Indian who lives in Germany right now, I find this to be a very, very interesting juncture to see Europe, where I'm based in, and India, where I come from, being in two very different spaces. And I find myself asking the question, can India and the EU, not just Germany, but can India and the EU, both supporters of a rules-based international order, can they collaborate to reform and safeguard multilateral institutions for the challenges of our times? Because the current multilateral institutions were founded in a different time and space in history. So India and EU both are very alike, but very different in some ways. And I'm wondering, how could a strengthened cooperation between the two look like? What would it take for them to find a common ground to start an honest conversation on this issue? Or how far are we already on that conversation? Because as we know, the 2025 EU-India strategic agenda reiterates that both parties' commitment to cooperating on sustaining global governance amongst geopolitical headwinds is something that they both want to respect. It also underscores the core motivation to driving collaboration, describing the EU and India as like-minded, trusted partners, also in support of a rules-based international order that is anchored in respect for sovereignty, effective multilateralism, and open, predictable cooperation. So while we find ourselves in this time where multilateralism is under immense stress, questions persist around the continuing motivation of players like India and the EU in their commitment to the rules-based order. So to get some ideas about where we are headed on this journey of EU-India collaborations, I am looking forward to having some insights by our esteemed panelists as introduced by Devika, and the ensuing round of questions that we will come up with. So I'm handing over to you, Tobias.
Thank you very much, Pratnya, for kicking us off and for this very, very good introduction. I would also like to extend thanks to my co-authors, to Raja and Devika, for Amrita, for being here and for commenting later, and for everyone who participates today in this session. Let me start by saying that I think this initiative to bring together different voices from the EU and India is very important, and perhaps there are few topics that are as important as multilateral cooperation, as this is really something where we get to the core of some misunderstandings, historically founded differences between the countries, but also where we meet the need for cooperation, as you just pointed out correctly, Pratnya, to the COP 30 this year in Belém. And I think the process of writing this paper kind of mirrors all the issues that you already also spoke about in a way, because when we kind of like started putting our points to paper, we realized, well, we cannot just start with our policy recommendations. We cannot just start by immediately coming to the implications of bilateral cooperation. We have to start at a point where we lay out why India and Europe got to the point in the international order where they are today, and why they got there, how they got there, and why they have extremely different views about what the rules-based order is. And I mean, for the last couple of years, we already automatically, and even in Europe, most people are not calling it the liberal international rules-based order for a reason, I think. But I think it also has to do with the growing awareness on this continent here that there are different views on what the international order has been from different vantage points of the world. And so the process of writing in itself of this policy brief has been, if you would like to term it this way, a learning process to also get to terms with the differences that we have with the international order itself. And I think why this is important to us as authors to kind of like lay down some of the historical narratives is because we, in the end, want to criticize the international order for what it is, but we also want to engage with it. We all know that we have our problems with how some of the institutions and mechanisms, processes, representation is organized in the international order. And at the same time, we know that we that we have to constructively, in a sense, criticize that order so that we can make it a better one. Because the EU and India are in the end unified by their shared belief that they don't want to trash the international order. And they are unified in the belief that no order is not an alternative, that the EU and India as individual actors are not strong enough and also not positioned in a way that they want to thrive in what you just mentioned as the right of the might, Pratnya. The EU and India want to have common rules, and one way we came to a conclusion was to coin in our paper shared principles as public goods, and we wanted to, in a sense, combine the two languages that the two actors have. India is very strong in its foreign policy on public goods, and whether we speak of India's vaccine diplomacy during the COVID pandemic, and its general narratives in different multilateral institutions, India speaks about public goods. And Europe in general has a much clearer voice on binding norms, on principles that bind together the international community. And what we wanted to make clear is in a way that, for example, the law of the sea, as one example, is a principle that serves everyone. That is a public good to every state, no matter how strong or how weak it is, how large or small it is, that there are that international rules have to serve everyone and not just the mightiest. And the EU and India want to contribute and should contribute in the future to a world where we can find such common ground in different areas. Let me just point to kind of one way how we thought about this when writing our paper. We realized that international institutions itself and some of the institutions are perhaps have become too much focused on producing an outcome document as the key achievable. You just pointed to the COP. There we have kind of like a very good example of an international process where the entire negotiations are surrounded on producing a document. This is, of course, a good and important step if you want to find solutions. But what we realized is if we are in the international order where we are now, with shifting weights of international power, with international actors who try to sabotage these kind of outcome documents, and where these documents don't count as much anymore to some actors, then we perhaps need to think more about the process itself and about mechanisms that we construct within this process. And this is why we, for example, included IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, as one example where Europe and India can come together and talk about kind of real life changes in the world, real interests that drive India, Middle Eastern countries, and Europe in their aspirations to create supply chains, to have equal access to resources, in their demand for energy, in their demand for energy transition and green transition, and to start at those more plurilateral, let's say, engagements where we can develop understanding, awareness about each other, and where we can take initiatives that start at a regional or at a plurilateral level and consider these learnings as something that we can take to the multilateral stage. And this is not to say to undermine multilateralism, but it's just, as I pointed out in the beginning, that both regions and actors, Europe and India, still have to grasp with this kind of mutual learning curve. They still have to understand where they're coming from. And I think to thereby sometimes break down issues, break down negotiations and even global challenges to a more kind of microcosmos, could help us to then in the end replicate successes and learning curves on a multilateral level. And perhaps I would leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Amrita, I'm going to bring you in at this point to see your views, because you've been based in Germany for a while. You led the GIGA, then you moved back to India. So I think you have a very specific vantage point of looking and understanding the nuances of this discussion from both sides of the conversation. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Pradnya. And it's great to see you again and Tobias, hello after all these years. And it's great, I'm very happy to be back on this panel and meet old friends and new. So let me start off by congratulating the authors on this excellent report. It is an honor for me to be a part of this timely discussion. And I thank colleagues at CSDR and the Heinrich Böll Stiftung for this very important initiative. Now, this report that is being launched today is impressive for many reasons. Overall, I see the effort to locate this bilateral partnership in a multilateral context as a really useful exercise. So kudos to you, dear Raja, Devika, and Toby. I'll now flag up just some of the several merits of the analysis that is provided in this report. And I'll flag up 4 points. So first, the key takeaways are very clear, as are the policy implications. So, for example, the authors write, by translating shared commitments into structured platforms for reform, Europe and India can shape a multilateral order that is both principled and practical, end of quote, right? And I think Tobias was also referring to bringing together these ideas in his comments, right, about the principle and the practical coming together in this partnership and applying this globally in a multilateral context. Second, I particularly enjoyed the historical section of the report, which provides an account of the differing European and Indian experiences with multilateralism. And this section does very well. I thought it does really well to call out the historical limits and contradictions of European multilateralism. And India's long-standing commitment as a founding member of several pillars of the system, but also its dissatisfaction with the system. So that historical narrative that you've given is a great value added to the debate. The third merit of the report, the challenges to the multilateral system are also well identified and well taken. So combining the internal experiences of the two actors and the changing external context, a very important point follows in the report, and it is this, and I quote you again. Given India's early disillusionments with multilateralism and the contemporary crisis of global institutions registers less acutely in New Delhi than in Europe, which has historically been more deeply anchored to and reliant upon the multilateral order. End of quote. Now, this sentence gets to the crux of the argument and the opportunity that we have at this moment. It tells us why the EU, in fact, despite the many shared values and interests with India and cooperation over the decades, might finally have reason to come on the same page as India as never before. Right? I think that's a really important point that this report is making. And that's, it's sort of the analysis, this is one of it's a crux of the report, and it captures the uniqueness and the importance of this moment. And fourth, I also liked the clear policy recommendations of the report, and some quite original, now, such as the role of a reformist G4. And there's a lot more in there. Now, so I have only 5 to 7 minutes, so I can't give you all the many interesting points they raise, but please read the report. Now, it's great to see so many, again, friends and colleagues in the audience. It's a great report. I think you'll enjoy it. Now I'll raise 4 points as questions and suggestions. I have more, but right now I'll just raise 4. So first, I would humbly question the use of the word inevitable in the title. Yeah, because amidst the turbulent times we live in, almost nothing is inevitable except perhaps for death and taxes. And just think back about how thick that the transatlantic partnership was. And then suddenly it wasn't. There is a great need for your report because there is, I would argue, nothing inevitable about the EU-India partnership. Both the EU and India have urgent choices to make. And your report is doing something very important. It's showing us why certain choices make more sense than others. And I would argue they may not be inevitable partners. Now, that deepening will happen because of choices that I hope they will make. So they may not be inevitable partners also in the multilateral context, but they certainly are key partners. So that's my first point. I'm not sure about the word inevitable. Second, let me also push you a little bit on the term rules-based in our discussion now. Now, I study an organization where this term is used a lot, the World Trade Organization, the WTO. But even in this heavily legalized regime, the term needs to be unpacked. So, for example, China's interpretation of the rules-based system turned out to be quite different from those of practically all other members of the organization when it came to state-owned enterprises, technology transfer requirements, and more. Now, that China shock in the WTO came from a different interpretation of the rules-based system. And China presented itself as a defender of the rules-based order. Now, but it's just that they understood the rules differently. Global South countries in general have been unhappy with the content of some of the rules when it comes to TRIPS and access to medicine and medical equipment, for example. Right? And going beyond the WTO, even the EU and India. Now, CBAM is a set of rules. Does India accept them readily and wholesale? No, it doesn't. So I think the rules-based system, that term rules-based, now is increasingly becoming an empty signifier. And to put back meaning into it, maybe we need to specify exactly which rules to support. Not which rules, whose rules, why these rules. No? And then we need to think about which should be supported, which need to be reformed, rethought, and which need to be perhaps thrown out. Third, the report rightly notes that India seeks to update the existing architecture, whereas the EU finds itself as a status quo power in many domains. Now, that's spot on. Now, despite, you give us a very strong reason why the EU should be on the same page as India, but still, in some ways, EU is still relatively a status quo power. India wants to update the existing architecture. And maybe in the discussion that we now have in our panel and with the audience, I would love to hear a little bit more on the very real differences between the EU and India. Now, what are these differences? Does it help to recognize them and name them and then show either how the two can work on those differences or how do we find ways to bypass them to work around them? And fourth, on the WTO and weaponized interdependence. Now, here I think maybe the report is just a little too sanguine. So for instance, towards the end, it identifies one of the tasks of the G4 as safeguarding the WTO against the weaponization of economic dependencies to resist trade fragmentation. Now that's a tall order, okay, to safeguard the WTO against weaponized interdependence. But even if we manage to do that somehow, I think if we did that, we would relegate the organization to complete irrelevance, because weaponized interdependence is a fact, and all the action will move outside of the WTO. So I would argue the goal should be to fundamentally reform the WTO rather than just safeguard it from the hard realities outside, because multilateralism serves a purpose. Now, and I think we need to be asking which parts of multilateralism are still fit for purpose, and where do they need reform, rewriting, rebooting. I'll stop there for now. Back to you, Pradnya.
Thanks a lot, Amrita. I think you did raise a lot of important questions. And before we get into a discussion, I would definitely want to give Professor Raja Mohan the opportunity to come in on his views and about where he sees the discussion and which direction it is evolving. So over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Bivalkar. It's really nice to be part of this. For us, I think at CSDR, I think doing this project with the HBF was really an important one because I think it's coming at a time when India and the European Union are trying to come closer, and we've somehow kind of discovered each other. And I think the next few weeks will show how far we can actually go and whether we can actually do something substantive on the trade front. So I think having a broader review of the new agenda between India and the EU was timely, and I think I'm glad to be part of this. Second, I think on this report itself, I think working with Devika and Tobias has been a great experience. And I think, as Tobias said, I think looking back at the history of how we've arrived at this juncture is quite interesting. And from the European side, the story, as there's a paper reveals, how the navigation from the Cold War to where Europe becomes actually the principal champion of multilateralism in the post-Cold War world. For the European Union, both the process of integration of Europe itself and to really advance the original European project that began at the end of the Second World War. Now, unencumbered by the Cold War, Europe was in a position to really take multilateralism to its really both within Europe itself and be the principal champion at the global level for the promotion of multilateralism. So I think that its story itself, I think we often don't tell ourselves in terms of, because there's so much of focus on the immediate, we don't fully understand where we're coming from. Second, I think for the Indian one too, I think there's some simplicity to the way Indians, we like to frame it. India has always been multilateral, or India wants the reform of the international system. I think India's own story is quite a complicated one. I think we capture a little bit there. Because if you see the independence movement, the lawyers who led it, a sweeping sense of internationalism as a newly independent country, wanting to do things at the global order. And having grown up in the interwar period, the critique of power politics was quite central to the original Indian national movement. That they would accept ideas which were really quite outlandish in some sense, if you look at it from a hard-nosed a realist perspective. But I think it was a genuine sense that the world needs a different framework. But I think India got schooled in the reality pretty soon. On the security side, the bumps on the road India hit on the Security Council after taking the Kashmir issue to the UN, and then the economic side, where I think India's, despite being a member of WTO, before that GATT, the sweeping sense of support for multilateral economic order was continuously constrained by the fact that as a latecomer to capitalism, how does it protect its industries and how does it work with the rules? And I think same argument we also see in the case of climate change. Well, I need to increase per capita consumption of energy, and therefore I cannot accept the kind of broader rules that people want. And I think the tension is an enduring one on the economic issue, that as a latent trend, wanting protection from the rules, while at the same time supporting the broader process. Third, I think there is, in the last decade, I say, there is a new tension, the need for realpolitik, the need for realism as India rises to the continuing rhetoric on multilateralism, rules-based order. I think those are a reality. And I think India can, keep talking about Security Council reform, but it's unlikely to happen. I mean, India and Germany are on the other side. So I think there is a tempering of both the sweeping sense of the need for reformed multilateralism, if you use the current slogan of India, and its objective possibilities. I think there is a tension. I mean, I think that's where I think I would say really exploring the opportunities for collaboration between India and Europe. I mean, Europe coming from the original champion of modern multilateralism to one that now must adjust to the new geopolitical realities. And in India, that on the rise, but still has huge challenges. Therefore, much of its principles and the rhetoric on multilateralism too, I think need to be adapted to the new realities. And that's why when we talk about multilateralism under stress, maybe, if you say, look, go beyond the paper and say, look, it's not in stress. As Amrita pointed out, it is under a shambles in many ways. That you have actually the onslaught of the last 9 months by one power, the number one power, is extraordinary. I think on what's happened in the WTO side and what little changes that are coming because of the domestic politics of the United States. The US has more inflation, okay, it might cut down some tariffs. If the Supreme Court rules out tariffs, it might come down something. But it is not an organized principle where the US is coming to it, essentially saying the rules don't work for me, and I'm going to trash them. So I think this is just not in the case of WTO alone. If Ukraine, whichever form the current peace deal might work itself out, the idea of a rules-based order, of non-use of force to change borders, whether it's in Asia or Europe, Chinese capability to violate UNCLOS and acquire new territories, or if Russia gains hold of eastern Ukraine, and Crimea already has it. So I think here again, I think both of us need to temper our rhetoric, I think, in different ways to come, look, here is a new situation. And I think our practice already is reflecting that. None of us went to WTO, neither India nor EU. We all negotiated bilaterally with the Americans, like much of the rest of the world, to different degrees of success. And as you know, in the European case, the argument of security was one of the considerations why Europe on the economic front was a superpower, but yet it simply moved along to deal bilaterally with the deal with the Americans without even actually having to, without really firming up the details of that agreement. So that's one part. And I think India too, I think was one of the first negotiators on the bilateral side. We still don't have a deal. So I think what the US is doing today to multilateralism, we can keep criticizing the US, but I think if there is a new reality where the multilateral institutions of post-91 are being challenged by both the US and China, what do we do in that context? And I think I would say I agree with Amrita that look, the answers that some of them we put out in the paper really preliminary of saying, look, when you say salvage what you can, really, I think we're not underestimating the challenge. But I think to the extent that what some of us can come together and do, those practical steps must be taken, even as we accommodate, appease, propitiate the challenger who poses such major immediate economic consequences and security consequences for all of us. So I think it is that pragmatic bent. But I would say really we need to, while we save our immediate economic interests, what are the things we can do to protect economic multilateralism? That's one part. Second, I think on the technological side and on climate change, both our rhetoric and our capabilities, I think there is a new tension. That for all the talk about India and Europe talking about climate change, really the Chinese have walked away with the domination of the sources of how to manage it. And I think they're going to exploit that to the hilt. Therefore, we need to develop those competences in green technologies, though green partnership is really at the top of India-European agenda. But I think we need to do a lot more to create actual competencies rather than framing it in broader, principles, terms of principles, etc. So the third place, I think, where the tensions are, I think it's really in the case of digital technologies, where we can say what we want about, there's going to be AI summit. We saw in G20 a lot of nice rhetoric from India and the other countries. But I think here again, US and China dominate the AI sphere. They will set the rules. And I think Europe, despite being one of the most advanced economies, has fallen behind on the technological side. While India has capabilities, most of them go into helping others doing it. That I don't think today we are in a position to say, look, to offer a significant challenge to either the US or China. So therefore, I think here again, I think how do we work together to create competencies? And how do we then create groups of countries that can say, look, here are broad possibilities of direction of where the, say, AI governance can go. I see the EU is already under pressure to walk back, because of the pressure from the American big tech companies. In India, we've not even made moves, though there's a rhetoric on the right and the left about the dominance of the American big companies, that we are hopelessly tied into it, just like Europe is. Or Gmail, or Outlook, or Meta. India is the biggest user of all these major platforms. So, but at this point, we say, look, how do we create new competencies? So there, I think practical collaboration on these technologies becomes very, very important to be able to shape the larger outcomes in the multilateral arena. So it's really been a pleasure working with Tobias and Devika, and thank you, Amrita, for your comments. And I hope the discussion will give us more light in terms of how we can take it further from here. I'll stop here, Dr. Prithvi.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. I see we already have some questions coming in the chat, but before I take those questions on, I have a particular question, and that is open to all my panelists, which is the conversation around values. So I think in one of the parts of the report, there is a conversation on Indian emphasis on equity and the European emphasis on standards, that kind of work as a common and pragmatic denominator, that shared rules are what makes globalization fair and sustainable. But more than often, there is a lack of consensus on what values are at the base of this conversation and who is defining those values. So for the longest time in the German context, the conversation was value versus value, Wert versus Moral. And I think there's a transactional element of the value, and then there is the moral value that goes along with it. So I think a lot of times the conversation kind of completely gets derailed because both sides cannot agree on where the convergence is. So where do you see that conversation around values being placed in the policy suggestions that you make? Because I think policy suggestions on a broader level will work only if there is a consensus on where we stand and what our definitions of those values are. So I see Tobias nodding along. So maybe Tobias wants to share his thoughts to begin with, and then maybe Professor Mohan and then Amrita will also want to come in.
Thank you, Pratnya. So I think in dealing with EU-India relations, for my individual case and in my research, I found it kind of that I could look most clearly at the relations if I look at the interest aspect of the two actors. I know there are different angles of like looking at how cooperation can work between them. But I think considering all the kind of different historical narratives, the different ways how we think about the international order and what our paradigms have been in constructing how we think about the international order. For me, it has been kind of most important that we come to our terms with our interests and are clear and realistic, and then, as you also indicated, predictable about these interests that we have with each other. It is, of course, important if we talk about our transformational projects that we have. And in the EU, the greatest narrative on a transformation has been on climate change. We want to have the green transition done. And and there are interests involved with this. And there's, of course, also a narrative that involves different values that we have that come from domestic politics. And in India, at the same time, if I follow it correctly, the greatest transformation that the country addresses and that politicians address is India's socio-economic rise and the economic growth that India tries to do in a fair and just way. So we have two transformational projects, and for these transformational projects, of course, values and norms play a role. But I think if we really want to kind of address each other with our different political ecosystems and different transformations that we aim to prioritize, then I think the language of interests is still the one that promises us the best dividends in the end. And I see Nicholas, hi there, a question on the Europe-India FTA, where I think this is a clear example as to why to prioritize interests here, because there are so many differences in the ways we understand what kind of we aim for when it comes to trade, that I think looking at our interests and what we want to, whether it is market access or whether it is to adhere to certain standards, gives us a much more clearer idea in the end to come to an agreement. And it also, for all its kind of, normative risks that a failure might involve, we could just circumvent this by focusing on what our long-term interests and long-term strategies are. So if I look at the free trade agreement and the other two agreements that the EU and India want to close, the investment protection agreement and the geographical indications agreement, then I look at it as steps in a process and as steps that we should be realistic about and that we should signal to each other that they are steps within a larger process of interest that we pose to each other, so that we have a predictable roadmap of where the EU and India should go to. And I see the signaling of values at some point as a too much of a risk, because as Amrita said, it is not that this partnership will just happen. There are risks to this partnerships, and I think to really look with sober eyes at each other and say, what is it exactly that we want from this partnership, can help us as a first step to kind of shape trust and economic relations and perhaps a security partnership in a much more reliant way. And I think that normative aspects of the partnerships would rather be than those that I would see as the ones following interests in the years to come, or following also on some of the projects that are launched right now. For example, the EU has just initiated this EU-India Young Leaders Exchange Program last week, which I think are then people-to-people ties, of course, that can create much stronger bonds between these two actors. So I think I'd leave it here for now.
Professor Raja, do you want to add something to what
briefly? I think the values debate is a big one. In fact, the multilateralism itself was seen as a value. Now, really, we're trying to temper it with the more focus on interests, given the circumstances we face. I think there is a bigger challenge that is unfolding, which is going to threaten, I think, the multilateral across, the developing countries. It's always been there, but I think the rise of the new nationalism and populism, whatever you want to call it, in the US and Europe, in fact, it's not just questioning the globalized order. It is actually challenging the very liberal premises of it. And part of the battle today across the Atlantic is really this that the problem is not just the globalist order that was created, but the liberal values underlying it, which directly affect domestic politics. And I think we're seeing that attack on that as a very much central part of the new approach that we've seen in the US. So while the US talks about non-intervention, I mean, if you read the Riyadh speech, Trump says we're not going to interfere in the internal affairs of countries. But if you see him actually interfering in Latin America or Europe, in fact, forget the rest of us. It's really that the US brazen intervention in the domestic politics of Europe. So I think this really much bigger issues are involved. I mean, now on the values question, that takes us into the immigration issue, the question of the kind of what is the liberalism that we've all had taken as the foundational aspect that itself is being challenged by the new forces. And I think we've still not affected all of our multilateral interests, but I think it's going to affect it as we go along. And say, if France under right-wing leadership or Farage taking over in Britain, we're talking about a new world, and I think dealing with that is going to be so. I think we should be prepared for these challenges rather than simply framing that we can simply go back to the post-91 emphasis on the kind of values that we've done.
So I'm hearing the urgency to reimagine the frameworks in which we want to work together in that sense. So Amrita, over to you. You're on mute, Amrita? No, again on mute?
That was a double click, sorry.
Yeah.
And thank you. Let me build on what Raja and Toby said here, because I agree with what Raja said in terms of, that really deep questioning of values that we're seeing now in the self-styled bastions of liberalism, right? But post-1991 moment was a very strange moment, right? And that entire liberal order, that so-called liberal order that was built on that. And a key component of that liberal order was its technocratic nature. Now, and that technocratic nature was built entirely on interests, right? The assumption was that, we'll trade with each other and everything will be sorted. We don't, and we all agree on the same values, which are all Western values. Yeah. And then we get we get this extreme questioning in, in Europe, in the US, about what are these values, and it affects every aspect of our daily lives, like from migration to trade, right? But let me offer a slightly different perspective now, and argue that actually values perhaps are one that, in some ways that dichotomy is a false one. Now, we don't just have interests coming out of nowhere. Interests come out of values, right? I think that's really fundamental. And so IR scholarship, international relations scholarship, has been very much dominated by this, in my eyes, this false dualism, right? And when you look at Indian scholarship in traditional strategic thought in India, you see that there is no dichotomy between interests and values. Now, the idea of dharma is one that incorporates both very clearly. And there are, there's sadharan dharma and there's swadharma. And I'm not going to go into the details of that right now, but we can talk about this later. Now, but so there is actually no dichotomy. And we can't, the reason why China acts in certain ways is it has something to do with its values, right? The reason why the Europeans give this really sort of guttural reaction to India's supposed non-reaction on Ukraine is not just interests, it's also values. Now, where can values come in and help? Now, India's been at the receiving end of lots of lectures from the EU on environmental standards. Let's look at what India is actually doing and look at the idea of lifestyle for the environment that India pushed for as part of its G20 presidency. Now, we're talking about not only human-centric development, we're talking about planet-centric development. These are, again, very Indian ideas. So wouldn't it be great if for once the EU and India were to sit together and really talk to each other about values with mutual respect, right? And that includes looking at things like animal welfare standards, Now, not environmental standards as defined by the EU, but what we mean by Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the entire earth is a family. Now, not just all peoples are family, the earth is a family. Now, that is a deep idea. There will be a lot of support for this in the EU, not industrial farmers, obviously, but there's a whole lot of people on the green spectrum who will support these types of ideas, and not just green, and consumers. So this is the kind of out-of-the-box thinking on values that I think the EU and India should push for to make globalization more secure and kind.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely with you on this about the dichotomy of, interest versus values. But moving on from that aspect of the conversation, because I think we can have an entire panel just around the conversation of values. I also want to bring in something that that was alluded to right now in the response by the speakers, which was around the fact that the value conversation can be beneficial to certain players who kind of, who reimagine this architecture. And I hear from the speakers that, there is a need to reimagine that conversation to begin with. And then Professor Raja said that, we have to be prepared for that kind of an eventuality where we will have that conversation sooner than later. But then I'm also asking myself this question: if we are doing that, if we are preparing ourselves, are we looking at strengthening or bolstering this partnership in the short term, or are we looking at making this partnership resilient? Because if you want to kind of prepare for an eventuality, you also have to put in some stopgap measures in place for that partnership to evolve and stay resilient, stay on course despite the changing around of things. So any thoughts on that before I pass on the questions from the audience to the speakers? Tobias, do you have any thoughts on that, about the resilience part?
No, I think it speaks directly to what I mentioned in my previous intervention. I think it is, especially looking back at this particular year, we have seen Commission's President von der Leyen putting a lot of pressure on the relationship. And I think, there's always one half of me that thinks that this was perhaps a politically, smart and bold move to signal that, the two partners now take it seriously to the next stage. And I mean, Narendra Modi was on the kind of same level as von der Leyen, and they both shared that they wanted to signal this boldness. But there is a risk involved in this. And this risk is that we always look at the next big thing in these relations, and that we always are at this stage, and those following the relationship closely, where we have to cast a doubt and say, well, it can go very right now, or it can give a very terrible signal. And in that sense, there is always a certain distrust also of the situation, whether we will be able to reach this compromise or not. And while I think it was in the end a good momentum that we created for the India-EU partnership at this stage, I believe it is important that we think in a more long-term trajectory for this partnership. Because only if you think in a longer trajectory, then, for example, companies will realize that investing in the other actor is something, that is worth taking the risk. That if the two actors bet on each other for the future as important as strategic partners, then you will have different political, economic actors who will kind of follow through with agendas that think beyond 1 year or one political mandate, and take the partnership forward. So I think predictability and a long-term trajectory is important, but also a realistic mindset in a way that you don't, kind of promise each other that everything you will do in your relations will just will be followed through in this agenda. the EU and India are both kind of complicated bureaucracies, and they will, not change overnight their system, and the two actors will probably move forward in much closer steps as they have done in the past. It's not the EU, it's not the India-US partnership, that over, of course, excluding this year, but the previous years could signal very different things in very in different ways. The EU and India partnership, I would assume, would be most successful if it incrementally moves forward.
Amrita, Professor Raja, do you have anything else to add? Otherwise, I will get
I just had a brief thing. I mean, I think
sure.
It's important to for India at least, not to frame this purely as an IR aspect. One of the central problems of India's trade multilateralism has been the absence of internal reform. That is the idea that we won't do anything, we won't change anything at home, but we'll keep arguing about high principles at the global level. I think that has been part of the problem. Okay, there is a structural justification in terms of as a late entrant to capitalism. It needs to protect sectors, industry, etc., etc. But I think what we saw in India over the last 40 years, even after the reform process, to constantly avoid doing right things for itself, forget the rest of the world. And I think while the negotiators win some space at the global level, it's really not followed through internally to make the necessary changes. So I think that is a central problem, and I don't think none of us who do IR do domestic economics. So it's all right for us to talk about it, but I think without internal reform, without progressive change at home, India can't simply handle the external world purely on the basis of principles or strategies of multilateralism. I think that is a question, and I hope we're seeing signs of some interest in reform in India. And if more reform takes place, I think India will be better placed to deal with this changing global economic order. Second, I think in one of the questions said, look, I think EU has this reputation, okay, they always demanded this purest FTA, but that world is not an order. In fact, the challenge today for all the major economies is how do you take the blow from the US? How do you diversify? How do you get things moving rather than judging every agreement does it meet the pure high standards of once the powerful EU? And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. Third, I think just going back from the values issue, I think there is one dangerous tendency, and I think for me at least, this notion of a civilizational states. I thought it used to be, a kind of particularly Asiatic thing. I saw the Russians and Indians and the Chinese talking about it. Now you see Russians talk about a civilizational state, and you see the American MAGA talks about a civilizational state. So I think this is actually breaking away from some sense of universalism. That I think, I know it's all right, Indians can say what they want, or some Asian countries can say what they want. If the argument comes from the West itself that there's nothing universal, and I think some of the MAGA people, and in fact, if you see some of the people in some of the State Department publications, make it clear, look, there is a different way of thinking about this. And I think this is an idea. We take it automatically when Indians say civilizational state. Sounds good, but I'm deeply skeptical of framing things in those forms, which has both domestic and international implications.
Absolutely. Amrita?
A very quick follow-up to what Raja just said. I agree with all that he's called for. Now, I would add to that call on the part of, with my sort of German European hat on now, to say one of the reasons why MAGA is misusing the idea of civilizational state and civilization is because much of Western scholarship has been very inward looking, right? So you look at traditional IR courses in the West, and the best you'll get is, well, you might get some Sun Tzu if you're very, very lucky, right? But otherwise you'll get Clausewitz and you'll get Thucydides, but you won't get very much else from the rest of the world, right? And so that insularity was always there, and it's taking a very ugly shape now. So this idea that, and we have universal ideas in some of India's old traditions. Not everything traditional across the world is good, absolutely not. But there are universal ideas in other cultures, and I think it's time that when the global south asserts some of these ideas, like rights of the rivers that are being protected in parts of Latin America and parts of India, right? Those are ideas that the West could learn from. I don't care which civilization they come from, but they're good ideas if they help save the planet. And I think there's a vast menu to choose from. So it's an addendum to what Raja just said rather than a contradiction.
So now bringing in the questions from the audience. We have quite a few of them. Some of them have been addressed in parts. So let me first club the question by Nicholas. The first part of his question is, how do we avoid a symbolic agreement between the EU and India in terms of the FTA that sends a strong diplomatic signal for the next Leaders Summit, but ultimately remains a shallow agreement in substance? That's the first part of his question. And then he goes on to build up on that question about plurilaterals as building blocks for wider multilateral progress. So maybe I'm looking at Amrita because I think trade is something that you have also extensively engaged on. And then, of course, Tobias and Professor Raja, you're welcome to add in.
I don't actually have an answer, Pradnya. I agree with the question that Nicholas has posed, because India has resisted plurilaterals very strongly, right? And it links up with the point that Raja was making, some of the defensiveness that India has posed in the multilateral trade negotiation process, right? Now, maybe with that, with the realism that is becoming more and more evident and the urgent need to adapt to the changed circumstances, international, maybe we might see some change, but I see this as the problem that Nicholas has identified. I agree it is a problem and I don't have a solution.
Tobias, Professor Raja, do you have any ideas on what the solution could look like?
Look, I think we shouldn't make the best the enemy of the good. When at this point, getting anything done between India and the EU is welcome. And I think India is not going to do the kind of things. So I think there'll always be a gap between the expectations and reality. But I think just moving along at this point is good for India. I mean, I would like to see India being far more reformist internally and making it easier for it to sign deeper FTAs. But we're not there. That's where not the politics are. So within that constraint, I mean, I think if India can move things, it can advance some internal reform, which I think is good. But that's where we are.
Tobias, do you have anything to add?
Just perhaps kind of reiterating that I
Okay.
believe that this FTA will be kind of just a step in a larger process. And I think that both actors will take back home after probably the smallest FTA that the EU has done so far in terms of its size and scope, that the EU will take back some homework for itself and reconsider whether measures such as CBAM do have the promised kind of effect that they have, or whether some of the effects are also, counteracting some of the interest that it has with its trading partners, that wants to rethink its own trade policy and climate policy. And India will take back as a homework, perhaps, that what Raja pointed to, that it needs to rethink the way it advances in its domestic reforms in some of the critical sectors, so that it can be more trade ready, if I can frame it this way. And I think then we hopefully will see a larger process over the years.
I can see Amrita grinning, so maybe she has a thought.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I do actually. One of the problems in trade has been that people have been thinking about trade as just trade and nothing but trade. Now, the reason why this moment is different is because of that weaponization problem. But the need for closer trade relations with strategic partners is evident now because of their security implications. So the more the EU and India recognize that the FTA is not just doing a trade deal, but it has very important security implications for strategic autonomy. I'm not saying link it up with arms deals, okay? That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying that that context, the securitized context, could be made to work in the favor of both parties, right? And the more, so, that also begins to address Nicholas's first question, right? That very shallow deal, even if it's a shallow deal, if it comes in that broader context, there's a greater likelihood of getting a deal that works and that will move.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. So the next question that I would like to bring in is by Ayush Kumar Sen, who is talking about the emphasis on strategic autonomy and how India and EU can institutionalize their cooperation in a way that reduces episodic friction while still enabling a joint leadership on multilateral reforms. So who wants to take that aspect? Because I think it's a broad question, but it also brings in some of the elements that you have suggested in the paper. So maybe Tobias or Professor Raja?
I'm a skeptic on strategic autonomy, so I'm not the one to be answering this question. So look, I think on the economic side, there is deep interdependence. See, when you talk about strategic autonomy in the context of security, even there, in the common language that India and Europe have now, Europe is part of an alliance structure seeking strategic autonomy. Well, India has never been part of an alliance system. Therefore, it is how it approaches that question is different. But I think both sides, are moving away from reliance on their past frameworks. Europe wants to do more for itself, be stronger, be an independent actor. It is able to defend itself, assuming over the next 10 years, if the current plans go. For India, I think the challenges it faces demands more collaboration, more coalition building, working with others rather than simply saying all the time strategic autonomy. So I think we are coming closer. And I think it's in that process that on security issues, on defense, where Europe that begins to rearm, bad word, and in India that is trying to privatize some of its defense industry, can work together, strengthen its core sinews. And I think, as I said in the earlier debate, without creating capabilities, to keep talking about strategic autonomy means nothing. So therefore, I think that is where I think there is a room here. We didn't go into this in this report, but that's a whole separate thing. I'm sure CSDR is going to do on that, on defense and security. What is it that India and Europe can do together? But on the economic front, the question is of managing interdependence. How do we now, when our biggest trade market, we have problems, and we have biggest imports from our principal adversary, China. So your trade deficit, India's biggest trade deficit is with China. So we keep talking about strategic autonomy. I mean, how do I get strategic autonomy from my total dependence on Chinese inputs for my manufacturing sector? That is the question. So this is a practical question. This is not a rhetorical device to keep affirming, as most of us in the IR field do, but it is. So that answer to that is, can India build up its PLI schemes? Can India build up more domestic manufacturing? Just as the Europeans want strategic autonomy, as St. Augustine said, oh God, make me virtuous, but not just yet. You can't let go the Americans if you want to deal with the Russian challenge. Similarly for us, we want to develop the PLI schemes, but today, all our exports are tied to Chinese imports. Therefore, what do I do? So these are difficult questions, and these can't be shoved under broader slogan of strategic autonomy. And I think here again, the good news is that India and Europe are coming closer. And I think on the security side and on the economic side, the more we do with each other, the more, say, for example, on the high-tech stuff, if India and Europe begin to develop collaborations, can we create an alternative model to the pure statist Chinese model of regulation of AI? And the pure market-based regulation of not regulation, the regulation is a bad word, of the Americans. So I think there are things we can do. So here again, the IR, those of us who do IR should step away from this and let the economists, let the practical people do things which create capabilities for us to actually create the foundations for strategic autonomy.
Thanks a lot for that. I'm looking at the questions, and there is one question which I think needs addressing, which is the conversation on IMEC about the India-Middle East, the corridor. And the question is from Nicholas Blerell, and he's drawing attention to the fact that the IMEC he's wondering if IMEC complements or contradicts other initiatives of the partnership, especially under the FTA, and if this could kind of, where that conversation will tie up with the FTA with the EU. So maybe some thoughts on that. Tobias?
Perhaps if I may start. Yeah, thank you, Pratni, and great to see you here, Nicola. Is the point that we basically see in our paper IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, as a test bed for other initiatives that can happen between the two. And not just, on this kind of bilateral or plurilateral level, but then kind of successes that should be replicated in multilateral conversations. And I think the starting point for us to include IMEC here is more because it also includes some of the challenges that we have in our own thinking when thinking about the partnership. So it's not necessarily the contradictions as you mentioned them in the question, but rather the complexity of the partnership, because the EU and India both want to diversify their access to different resources, to rare earths, to copper, etc., and at the same time, kind of investing in new mining facilities around the world is something that actually raises a lot of questions for the EU's agenda on net zero. However, if you want to create more strategic autonomy as an actor, or you want to diversify the imports of specific goods, resources, but also services, then IMEC is one project that allows you to think through what kind of compromises are you willing to make when you try to recognize one of your goals being the green transition, another one of your goals being diversifying your imports, another goal being to kind of link yourself closer to another strategic partner or several strategic partners and reduce your dependencies on China. So I see IMEC rather through the lens of kind of like these diverse challenges that the EU tries to solve at the moment. And of course, there are some projects that the EU itself has kind of initiated, such as the Global Gateway initiative, where this kind of geo-economic rethinking also kind of took shape since 2022. And to kind of conclude with my point here, it of course raises also the question on how much the EU kind of wants to see a free international trading order. And this might be one potential contradiction, as opposed to a strong state or a strong union that steps in through building infrastructure and kind of being a more proactive factor in the international trades order. So how high should be the role of the state, or in this case, the union, of kind of stepping in for some of what could be otherwise framed as the liberal trade order in a way, right? So in that sense, I feel, and we felt it's worth kind of flagging IMEC here in that sense for our paper as a project where many of these kind of puzzles have to be thought through and could then be kind of thought through in a later stage at the multilateral level.
Thanks a lot, Tobias. I am going to bring in the question now, which is more of It ties up with the concern that Amrita raised earlier about the inevitability. But this is a different spin on that, which is the question of inevitability. Does it not actually address the real issue? And maybe we should not aim at kicking it out as India and EU are trying to confront the new domination of China. So I see on the panel we have a divergence on that particular conversation. So any thoughts on that? Tobias, Professor Raja, as authors of this report, there is a reason that you brought in inevitability.
Really, no, there's partly exhortation, right? I mean, partly invocation. That if the scale of the crisis is so challenging today with what the US is set out to do across the board. I mean, I think the economic is only one. We heard about Trusteeship Council, but here is US President declare himself the president of the Board of Peace in Gaza. He says he'll be the presiding over the peace process. I mean, this is a break from everything we've known, even from the colonial era. The trusteeship and this is extraordinary. So I think, and that I think, look, we have to be very, very mindful of one thing here, which is really the power differential between the US and other major actors has grown. And I think partly the US can get away with it. I mean, you see what happened on the Security Council on Gaza resolution, a resolution that was totally one-sided, pro-Israel resolution that gets passed with the support of the Muslim countries. Russia and China don't even stand up and say no. So you are 13-0 on a resolution that kind of violates every single previous resolution on Palestine, Middle East. There you are. I mean, so I think it's because the US is so powerful. I mean, to give one example, in 1990, Eurozone was almost 75-80% of US GDP. Japan was 65-70% of the EU GDP. Today, the US at $30 trillion is almost, double the size of EU. Japan is only around 4, not even 5 anymore, 4 plus something. So to see the scale of how the other key economic actors have fallen behind the US in terms of aggregate capabilities. China is the only one which has risen in relative terms. Today, China is at $20 trillion. So it's continuing to grow. The US is growing at 3%. China is going to grow at 4 or whatever they say numbers. So you have actually the concentration of power in the hands of the US and a China that is emerging as the challenger. So I think this world, requires, and dealing with that power differential must inform what we do. So I think that is quite critical as we go ahead, because the US can get away with a lot of things. And that brings us to the question of realism, the question of how we manage this transition and how do we build a wider coalitions, difficult as that will be.
Tobias, do you have anything to add, or can we move to the next question? Yeah, okay, all right. So the next question is focusing on the sustainable supply chains and how can India, EU cooperate to create resilient, sustainable supply chains that both reduce dependencies on China, but also contribute to global emissions reduction rather than just geographic shifting of the points of production. So any thoughts on that? I think that this is a conversation that all three of the panelists could add to, so I don't want to single out one person. So whoever is ready with their thoughts can jump in.
I'm not a trade guy, I'm not an economist, but look, I think it's one thing for the foreign offices to sit and say we should have resilient supply chains. You've seen how difficult it is to move actual things. Even India and you, for example, if you see the Indian capital will prefer working with the Chinese, importing cheap Chinese stuff, rather than, so I think this way, the concentration of manufacturing capacity in the US at 35-40%. The effects of it on Europe, on India are increasingly becoming evident. So I think how do we deal with this requires, a lot of effort. Merely saying, look, let's simply reorder the supply chains. We've seen how hard it is. Where the US tried this, it had to step back, even on the semiconductor side. So I think here again, I think it goes back to creating capabilities in the rest of the economic actors. And then this requires, again, I think, substantive internal change.
Amrita?
Yeah, so it's about domestic capacity building, and that has to be taken very seriously. And this also links up actually with the inevitability question, because what Raja said about, India's extreme dependence on China, right? And so or for example, the EU hedging its bets. It's been hedging with China, understandably so perhaps, for a long time now, right? And so these are choices that we have to make. And we have to be aware of the seriousness of the risks of this overdependence. We saw it during times of COVID. And that's just one example where we saw it was life-threatening. No? It was a matter of life and death, literally. And so it's about domestic capacity building. It is about working closely with trusted allies. And that's where EU and India do have scope, right? And that's where values will come in my eyes, because of the nature of democracies that they are, and so on and so forth. But it's also about the international rules, because some of what is going to have to be done is going to be a violation of WTO rules, right? To start with, just MFN, if nothing else, right? Most favored nation status, national treatment obligations. Now, so there is going to, and the current exceptions allowed are not going to suffice. And that's why a lot of the action is moving out of the WTO, right? And so either we accept that and we say, okay, all the action is going to be out of the WTO. I don't think that's a good thing. I'm not recommending it. Or we think about a way to reform the WTO. That's not an easy order. That's not an easy issue. But it's, for me, this is at 4 levels. The problem has to be addressed: domestic capacity, working closely with trusted allies. 3, those allies, there is a link on values. And 4th, the international rules need to be updated, or the system will completely fragment.
And staying in the conversation around climate cooperations, do you think a track 2 process could be a good way to come to a good compromise solution over CBAM? Tobias, or you're I think also involved in quite a few of these conversations here in Berlin, so maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are now already quite a lot of bilateral conversations on track 1 level. Of course, we do have the Trade and Technology Council, which is added to the free trade agreement conversations. We do have different track 1.5 and track 2 formats between the EU and India, but also between member states of the EU and India. What I do think must follow is to be more inclusive than to private sector voices and companies who then would follow through with this agenda. I mean, for the past 2 or 3 years, I think governments and the EU and India have done their job in kind of laying out that green hydrogen cooperation is one of the areas where they want to cooperate. And I think it is very clear that the signaling from both sides goes into the direction that this is within the green agendas of both countries, one area where they want to do stuff. But the next step then would be to include those companies who would like to act upon this agenda. And I think in that sense, to bring together those actors, in this case, it was the private sector, and others, it would be other actors who would implement the EU-India partnership and would be the most important thing to actually follow through.
Thank you so much, Tobias. So I think with that, this is on the dot landing, as we say it in German. We are a minute before 12, and it was a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, all the panelists, and the Bildungsstiftung CSDR for putting this panel and the report together. It has been quite interesting for me as well to engage with this. Over to you, Devika.
Thank you, Pradnya. Thank you so much. Very expertly moderated. Great. You ended right on dot. as you mentioned. I want to quickly thank all our panelists, attendees for joining us today. This has been, like I said, this is a concluding report and discussion. I would like to thank HBS, Hyokan, Shalini, and Abhishek in particular for collaborating with us on this project. It has been a long, eventful year tracking aspects of the India-EU bilateral as we build up to the summit, hopefully early next year. This has been an effort in addressing persisting gaps in understanding on both sides of the party. I think anybody who works on India or the EU will be familiar with this complaint that we just don't have enough expertise or scholarship in New Delhi or Brussels or Berlin on India and EU. So that is what we are working on here. We have worked with a network of scholars across this project, and I think we have seen legitimate cause for optimism for the bilateral. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to collaborate with HBS again on the India-EU relationship. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks so much.